Teaming up with another thief, Chloe Fraser, they're racing against... not the right words. Hey everyone, welcome back to Arguing Semantics. Today we are talking about the long-awaited, oft-delayed, stuck-in-development hell live-action adaptation of Uncharted. Uncharted, based on the Sony Entertainment video game series of the same name, directed by Ruben Fleischer and starring Mark Wahlberg, Tom Holland, and Sophia, Uncharted tells the story of a young Nathan Drake, a small-time thief and history buff who is recruited by Victor Sully Sullivan, who used to work with his brother Sam, in order to find the lost ships filled with gold from Magellan's expedition around the world. Teaming up with another thief, Chloe Fraser, they're racing against the villainous Santiago Mancada and his henchman Braddock in order to solve the clues and find the treasure first. Now, the first thing that you have to get out of the way, especially because this is the question with any video game adaptation, was it good? And this one was good. I actually really enjoyed this one. When you're talking about video games, there's always the caveat, because you have to ask yourself, was it a good movie and was it a good adaptation? As a movie, it was a good movie. Really enjoyed it. A lot of reasons to like this one, a lot of reasons to go see it. If you're a fan of the Uncharted games, it's a just okay adaptation. There's only so much you can do when you're adapting a video game franchise into a movie, and this one made a lot of the right choices and a few of the wrong ones. Ultimately, they did make some small changes to the lore that make doing a prequel kind of silly, but overall they're just kind of telling their own story, and it worked out okay. The movie in and of itself is very, very fun. It is just a straightforward action-adventure film. Instead of choosing to do a more broad and fantastical story, they went with just a straightforward find the treasure story, which for the first part of a franchise is a good idea. It was a little disappointing because the story that they chose lacked some of the more fantastical or grandiose elements of a lot of the video games, but there really is only so much you can do in a live action setting when you only have 2 hours to tell a story instead of an 8 to 20 hour video game. While it hit all the points that a good action adventure needs to hit in order to be a watchable movie, it didn't quite reach the highs of some of the other examples in the genre. It didn't quite have the historical resonance or puzzle solving of something like a National Treasure. It didn't quite hit the globe-trotting levels of, say, an Indiana Jones. It didn't quite hit the action and cinematic highs of, like, the early Pirates of the Caribbean movies. But it did do everything it needed to do and was totally good at that. The only thing that it really had standing out for it was the actual fight choreography was very good. A lot of really good parkour, a lot of good hand-to-hand fighting. The stunts were excellent. On that level, it did its job pretty well. There were a couple of good chase sequences, as well as some good ticking clock moments in there as well. Overall, from a purely movie-watching standpoint, it's solid. As an adaptation is where it starts to falter a little bit. Overall, the characterizations were fine. Mark Wahlberg as Sully being the standout, he was excellent in this. He was probably the one I was most nervous for initially, but nah, he pulls it off. A lot of fun as his character, and you can tell he's having fun playing the character as well. Tom Holland was solid, but not quite there. He didn't quite have the roguish charm that Nathan Drake has in the video games. Wasn't quite as personable, had the right level of snark, but overall felt a little bit more dour, a little more reserved than Nathan Drake in the games is. But overall good. I did enjoy his performance, and he did anchor the movie well. The only real kind of disappointment as far as the cast goes was Sophia as Chloe. Chloe is a hard pair of shoes to fill, and she wasn't quite up to the task. Totally solid by herself, but didn't pull off the action as well as she could have. She always felt a little bit flat, but still totally fine. Fit in with the cast pretty well. The villains were also solid. Antonio Banderas is always pleasant to watch, and Tati Gabrielle as his second-in-command Braddock was also a good malevolent presence. Neither of them felt like they had enough going on. They didn't give Santiago in particular much to do. But it was still fun to watch, just ultimately the villains were a little bit forgettable. It was more about the story being told and watching the back and forth between our three mains. The other thing the movie really lacked was, as I mentioned earlier, it lacked some of the more fantastical elements of the video games. The video games always have a a thin layer of supernatural stuff going on in them that this one completely lacked. It was a straightforward, we are finding the treasure story. It felt closer in line to National Treasure than it did the Uncharted games. It lacked some of the interpersonal drama. It lacked a lot of the heightened nature of it, some of the more grandiose spectacles that happen in that game. It also didn't help that the overall cinematography felt a little flat. It was pretty straightforward and never hit the highs of some other action-adventure fare, especially when compared to the source material. Naughty Dog has one of the best cinematic eyes in the gaming industry, so pretty much anything they were going to do was going to kind of pale in comparison, which is the other thing that has me kind of nervous about the Last of Us adaptation that's coming soon. We'll see how that turns out. And then the other big part of the cinematography was some of the special effects felt overly CG. There were some green screen sequences where everything felt a little plastic, a little too fake. It didn't blend very well, especially with the more flat cinematography that made the real stuff feel much more real or much more physical and tangible compared to the more over-the-top CG sequences that happen in the second half. There were also some stuff in the movie that requires some serious suspension of disbelief. If you've seen the trailers, you'll know a couple of things that I'm talking about, which is the other weird thing is that there were a couple of different scenes in the trailers that just weren't in the movie at all, which is always a weird phenomenon. It's understandable, but still felt a little, okay, that's odd. They also set up a bunch of twists and revelations to happen later in the movie. There were a couple that were pretty shocking, but for the most part, they lacked teeth due to the relatively bloodless nature of this particular production, but most of them were pretty obvious and you kind of saw it coming a mile away. As far as some of the other changes that they made, there were some small changes to the lore that kind of felt unnecessary in the sense of they changed things to make the story work instead of trying to make the story work within the lore of the video games, mainly changing aspects of Sam leaving Nate at the very beginning. They changed the reasons a little bit. Changing the treasure they were seeking also felt a little bit weird because one of the problems with doing a prequel adaptation to something is you have to make the adaptation fit into the lore of the thing that you're adapting. This movie did a very bad job of that. By changing certain elements of the plot, it made it so that it doesn't fit into the games as well. The Uncharted movies are now in their own universe, and there is no way you can make them fit directly. So you have to keep that in mind. Yeah, the events of the movie will in no way fit in with the game as it stands. As a standalone, it works just fine, but there is no way you can make it work anymore. They did one of the other weird things that a lot of movie adaptations do, where they take events from the game but put them in a completely different context, so now you're not going to be able to use them later. Mainly the set piece that they start the movie off with, that you see in the trailers, with stuff falling out of the cargo plane, is something that didn't happen until the third game in the series. So that set piece is now completely used up. I mean, it was just in there to give the gamers something to latch onto, but why put it in there if it doesn't fit with the games themselves if you're adapting for a prequel? Speaking on the cargo plane scene, there are actually a few pieces of pretty good fan service. You'll notice the Naughty Dog logo show up a couple of times. They make a couple of references to stuff that happens in other movies, and there are a couple of well-placed, very good cameos. One at the end that you almost don't recognize him, but very fun. They did just enough fan service in there to make you feel like they did know what they were adapting and they were trying to make something that fans would enjoy. And I think mostly they pulled it off. But then at the same time, as I said before, they made some changes to the lore that felt like they didn't actually know what they were doing or what they were adapting. I think part of the problem with the adaptation is that ultimately, after bouncing around to director, it landed on Ruben Fleischer, who has a very hit or miss career. It probably doesn't help that they were filming parts of it during the pandemic, which probably limited their ability to add scale to much of the film. But Ruben Fleischer's career has been really hit or miss. Zombieland and Zombieland 2 are two of my favorite experiences that I've had in the theater. They're both very fun, very funny, slick, and well made. At the same time, you have stuff like Venom, which was underdeveloped and a bit of a mess and didn't quite figure out what it wanted to be. You have Gangster Squad, which was pretty good but fairly bloated and didn't really come together in the end. And then And then finally you have 30 Seconds or Less, which was an ill-advised mess that turned an actual real-life tragedy into a goofy comedy that wasn't very funny. And all that plays into it as well. His body of work does not reflect a really strong voice outside of the two Zombieland movies, so he might not have been the best choice. In a lot of ways, the direction itself felt like it was kind of going through the motions. It was heavily reliant on the script rather than anything the director brought to the table. It felt like kind of a script by committee, a direction by committee, rather than a unified concept of what the movie wanted to be. There were also some events that happened where you have to suspend your belief a little bit too much with some of the physics that takes place in the movie. A lot of them are just simple stuff like people jumping from one area to another or being able to hold on to a ledge or something being able to support them that it wouldn't be able to a moment at the end that they also put in the trailer that made both me and my wife both go, could they even do that? Would that even work? I feel like that would be too heavy, kind of a situation. But overall, because of the heightened nature of a lot of the story, it was pretty easy to get past those moments and suspend your believability. The only other thing that made the movie feel a little weird as an adaptation was it also lacked some of the more fantastic elements. The tone of the movie also lacked some of the more grounded edginess of the games, the more dark aspects of the games. It was interesting to see how they basically avoided giving Nathan Drake a gun. Considering that Nathan Drake, I believe I watched a thing where they said somewhere along the lines of Nathan Drake, if you add up all of the bodies in all the games, he has killed something like 500 people. And in the movie, they do everything they can to have him fight hand to hand and don't even give him a gun until the end of the movie, and then he barely uses it. It's not a big deal. Like I said, it's an adaptation, and they're just doing a straightforward, fun movie, so they don't need to have as much shooting, but it did feel a little weird and out of place. They were definitely going for that PG-13 really hard, and I feel like they could have pushed it a little bit more than they did. So even with all of those complaints that I have, some of the flat cinematography, the changes to the lore, some weaker performances than others, the villain's not feeling like that much of a threat for most of the movie. Overall, though, I will say the action was great, the stunts were good, the characterizations were still fun, the script was nice and straightforward and to the point and didn't try to do anything too fancy and bog itself down. It was just a very, very fun little action-adventure movie. It's not going to blow your mind. It doesn't hit the heights of some of the other examples in the genre, but it was very, very fun. And it was also a good setup for more movies going forward. I would like to see these characters return. And the end of the movie does set that up, so we'll see how well the movie does. I can tell that the theater that we were in was pretty packed, so who knows? We'll have to see what the box office says in a couple of days. But overall, yeah, it's a recommendation from me. I actually really liked Uncharted. I think we have finally hit the point where filmmakers are starting to figure out how to adapt these video games in ways that make fun movies, even if they're not necessarily the best adaptations. At least they're good movies. I walked out going, yeah, it felt enough like an Uncharted movie. It wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, but it was very good, and I had some worries about that. It's a solid action adventure. There's great action. There's great stunts. The cinematography is overall pretty good. The plot is good. There are some really good misdirects near the end. Some really funny dialogue. The interactions between Nathan Drake and Sully are awesome. You can tell those two are having fun playing off of each other. Tom Holland did mention in an interview that he was having some trouble finding the character even by the end of the movie, and you can kind of feel that, but still, the interactions between the two of them worked really well. I'd like to see more. I can pleasantly say, thumbs up. I enjoyed it a lot. I'd give it like a 7.5 out of 10, but it's definitely worth your time if you want just a good night at the theater. That being said, my name is James, and I've been arguing semantics.
Like and subscribe.